Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I have no idea how many people are online, but welcome to those of you who are online as well. For about an hour, we are going to hear about the report that has been produced in partnership by Localis and the Housing and Finance Institute. There'll be time for questions, there'll be time for discussion, just a little bit my background. My name is Steve Fuller. I'm the chair of the Housing and Finance Institute, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, was set up after a report that was produced by Keith House and Natalie Elphick quite a long time ago now. And it's a cross-party body with professionals as well as people like me, an ex-politician, and what it seeks to do is to work with and support particularly local authorities as we increase the supply of affordable homes. Easy thing to say. The reality is we weren't producing enough when the HFI was set up. We're now producing even less. The road I live in, at the top of it, hospital for homeless families. And one of the things which really excites you is that the vast majority of families who pass through there, somebody is working in those families, but they still can't find anywhere in this case, South East London, that they can afford to live. And we know that that is replicated over and over again. So what we thought we would do is we would get two people who look at these issues, who know what they're talking about, to do a think piece for us, to try and stimulate some discussion, try and stimulate some ideas about how we can change the way things are going, because we have to, because the situation, as I say, is deteriorating. So we asked Peter Bill, who is both a professional surveyor, I believe.
Professional surveyor,
yeah.
Years ago.
But also a very persuasive writer, and Jackie Sadek, who has got huge experience around development and regeneration, people who know how things work, people who can give us thoughts about how we can make them work better. I'm delighted that we've also got David Simmons and Eamon McGoldrick. David is a Conservative MP, and you're the chair of the APPG for Housing and Planning. Eamon has got a number of roles. Probably the most relevant today is the work that you do in Barnet, where there is a group of housing companies owned by Barnet Council, and Eamon is the chair of the overarching board of them. But again, both of these people have massive local government experience and knowledge around housing. They are going to respond after we've heard from the authors, and then we're going to throw it open to yourselves. At the end of all that, all being well, Natalie Elphick, who is currently in the Home Office, will have been released by the Home Office, and will be back here to talk about not just this, but also some other thoughts that the HFI is developing about the way it's going to go forward. So enough from me. I think you're going first.
No, I think he's going first.
That's a good start.
I always go first because Peter is the brains behind the operation and has to clean up whatever it is I say. So, you know, that's generally how it works. So just to say, the format for Pierre and myself today, and we're an old double act, as you probably can tell already, is that I will wave my arms about and give you the generality, and he will then give you the nuts and bolts and tell you how the model actually works. So stand by your bunks. First thing I have to say, though, is my huge thanks, put on record my huge thanks to both Localis and to the Housing Finance Institute for commissioning this work from Pete and myself. We've greatly enjoyed doing it. As with all these things, it's taken longer than we expected, but we think the timing of it is now pretty well impeccable, in that we think people are now prepared to open up and start to think new ways of delivering. It goes without saying that we have a housing crisis. Put to one side whether you can have a crisis that's lasted for 40 years, but you know, it goes without saying we have a housing crisis. It's actually, if anything, getting worse. We are not building enough homes of all tenures. We're not building enough. And I know there's some proper professionals in this room who are doing their bit, but we're still not building enough. And of course, the real crisis, as Steve's already alluded to, is in affordability. We are simply not building enough homes for people on council waiting lists. Now, there's 1.2 million households waiting for homes on council waiting lists as we speak. So this is a pretty massive travesty actually developing, or has been developing over the last 40 years. Those 1.2 million households can't afford more than half local market rent. So already there is this massive problem opening up. 40 years ago, and I'm sorry to keep using the 40 years, but you know, we do go back 40 years. 40 years ago, 85% of new build homes were at rents that council tenants could afford. And now today, it is merely 15%. So this is a major and burgeoning problem. So what Pete and I have done is, first of all, understand, and Steve's very generous in his introduction, that we both of us, although I have worked in the public sector quite a lot, we are both of us fairly essentially private sector operators, and we have come at this with a market-led type approach. What we've done is we've identified an approach, and it isn't the answer. There are no silver bullets in the housing crisis. It is merely a contribution, and we've attempted to not trouble ourselves with any legislation or any need to, you know, worry central government at all. We've attempted to do this approach by utilising powers that are already available to local authorities in particular, which is why we so favour Localis and a localist approach. So we say, number one, we need to build a new generation of council houses. Now, we slightly duck the issue of embracing council housing full on by calling it the PRH, the public rental homes sector, because, not to put too fine a point, and I'm sorry to sound cynical, we know the property industry and we know how much they like a buzzword. You know, you've only got to look at the way they populated PRS and then BTR to say, if you were to say to the private sector, what about PRH? They might run with it, okay? So we've gone with PRH rather than council housing. So number one, we need to build out a whole new generation of council houses, but councils are hollowed out. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you had the borough architect, the borough engineer, the borough surveyor. We know these people are no longer there. That capacity is no longer there. There is capacity, and I'll come on to that in a little bit, but the old big housing departments within local authorities are no longer. So what we say is, number two, local authorities have to go into partnership with the private sector. And that means you've got to allow the private sector to make a proper rate of return. And that's got to be built into the model, or else they won't be interested, and Pete will come on to that in a minute. Number three, we're saying, let councils take the lead. And at this point, Jonathan Warren rushes up and kisses me because, of course, he is basically trying to get the councils to take the lead on all of this stuff. We're saying bottom up, not top down. Go with the people who want the relationship with you. There's a shed load of pocket plots owned by the state in all its forms, and we're saying go with those. Most of those are worth nothing without a planning permission. We know who can accord planning permissions. We know who's in charge of all of this stuff. And you could, incidentally, whilst you were doing all of this, stimulate work for the hard-pressed small and medium-sized building sector who really do need some stimulus. There's a great old win to be had in all of this. But really what we're saying is we're a bit exhausted with housing policy debate, we're going to be frank. We're saying to people, and there are some very interesting examples up and down the country. We've just heard about Barnet. Obviously, another good example is Barking and Dagenham. We're saying just get on and deliver. Stand not around waiting for permission, just get on and deliver and ask for forgiveness, because actually that way you can make things happen. I've got two organisations that I particularly want to thank. Now, we had a lot of help in all of this, had a lot of help from the market players, We had a lot of help from people from like SIPA, DCN, LGA, those sorts of people. But two standout thank yous have to be made by Pete and myself. The first is to the Association of Chief Estate Surveyors, who are represented here in the room today. These are the asset managers in all the local authorities. These are the poor guys who have to manage all the assets in local authorities and have to work with people in order to bring forward those assets or not. And we have had enormous support and help from them. And it would be they that would be charged with delivering this project if it came to it and if it was appropriate for any particular local authority. So my thanks to the Association of Chief Estate Surveyors, commonly known as ACES, who are my friends, and they have been fantastic, and I'm grateful. And the other shout out we have to give is to Janice Morfitt, who some of you will know, a very venerable planner and data scientist almost, who has carefully documented all the work local authorities have done in this arena, and who we talk about quite a lot in our report because it's all there. And what she is saying is, we know local authorities can do this because they're already doing it. And what we're saying is, yes, you're already doing it, but can we please ramp up that delivery? So my thanks also to Janice Morfitt and her team for all the work they've done, because what they've given us is this invaluable data set. So that's all very good news. So thereupon, I have to hand over to my partner in crime, Peter Bill, who's done all the work and is the brains behind the operation, as I say, and who will take you through how the model would actually work in practice. Pierre.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jackie. It's going to get a bit dull for a minute or two, but just bear with me. I mean, first of all, say thank you to Steve. I'm glad to think that he knows we know what we're talking about. I mean, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Now, what I'm going to do, I'll talk about two things. One is something which most people know about, but it just needs explaining in some slightly boring detail, which is how a residual land value calculation works. It's not quite as boring as it might seem. And then secondly, I'll talk about how this might be. If any of you've seen the report itself, it does have a whole page on residual land value calculations. Right, this is the lecture bit. The site-by-site value of housing land is calculated by estimating the total sales, aka the gross development value, a profit of 20% on private sales and 6 to 7% for discounted sales to housing association is then removed from the gross development value. You then take off all the costs, which include everything from construction, Section 106, community infrastructure levy, finance costs. You subtract that from the GDV. What you're left with is the residual land value. You're left with what the land is worth if you do these things on it, okay? That's the current model for residual land value. In the table, you'll find one which basically says the income from, I think it's whatever it is, number of houses, 150 houses is 39 million. Take away the costs of doing that, 26.8 million. Take away the profit of 5.4 million, the land's worth 6.8 million, okay? That figure is the one that moves up and down and around when you put up the GDV or you put up the costs or lower the costs. That's the sort of banjo bit in the middle that you have to keep your eye on all the time. That's the figure that everybody argues about, okay? Now, the PRH model reverses the current model by saying, sorry, the current model, I should have said, is based upon, we want to build this many private houses. Council says, well, we want lots of affordable. So the argument is always how many affordable can be afforded within the development model to get to a residual land value that either matches what the guys have paid for the land or what the land might be worth. So that's the current model, is how many public sector houses do we have to concede to the council in order to make this work? Our model flips that and says, how many you work out how many PRH houses you want, and you then work out how many private houses you need in order to support that. So it flips the viability model. It works out how many PRH can be built from a set number of homes allowed on the site. So there's 100 homes allowed on the site. How many of these can we afford to be half market rent PRH houses? That's the top of the model, not the bottom, the bit that you start with rather than the bit that you end up arguing with the council about. The principle of the whole thing really is that if the viability study shows a positive land value and everybody is agreed on it, fine. You get on the building. What does happen, of course, is because the PRH houses are so low in value, the land value quite often turns negative, and in many cases can be negative or zero. In that case, the residual land value becomes the central point in arguing for cash from government or Homes England or whatever. That's the point in which you say, this will work, but you must give us this much in order for the residual land value to get to zero, because the profit's already built in, remember, or whatever. So that's the idea. And so the table in the book, you will see, consists of, where are we? 75 private houses at 300 grand each, 75 PRH houses at cost of £150,000 each, which is about what the council can afford to pay in order to make the rent work. You do that and you come up with a gross development value of where it is, 35 million. You take off the same expenditure off the other one and you end up with a residual land value, which is much less. The other one was 6.8, this one's 1.5. The residual value comes down in proportion to the number of the gross development, okay? It's probably, and I think then you end up with the build costs are the same, but guess what? The profit for the builder goes up from 5.5 to nearly 7 million. You're giving more profit to the builder because you've got to attract these people to build these things. You can't just wave a wand and hope the builder's going to come in and want to do this for you. So that's probably quite enough on that side of it. But you have to, the principle is that if it works on the development appraisal, you would go to the next stage and start talking seriously to and having a contract where the builder and the council deals with it. Okay, now we'll just need a glass of drink of water. How would it work? How would it work? First of all, it's just a new concept, okay? Just a new way of thinking about very old problems, all right? It's not changing the world too much. It's really there to add to rather than change what's going on at the moment. It's a way of allowing councils to become involved without getting too involved with their in risk. It's been constructed to appeal to both parties. It's something that the Conservatives should be able to say, yeah, we want to do that. There's a little site down the road with we've got a bit of land that's worth sod all. We can get 30 houses on that bit of land. Let's see how many private developers could give us some council houses to go with it. So it's not saying, you know, you've got to have 30% PRH. It's just a way of getting these things built. If it's Labour Council in the north and it thinks, well, this is quite a good idea, we only want social rented housing, but we want 40% social rented housing, well, that's fine. If that's what they want, they can have it. But only if the viability study works. There's no point in having these targets if they don't work. So it's, in that sense, it's party politically free, if you like. I think it's a sort of adding quietly to the towns and villages model. I don't think this is a model for volume builders at all. I don't think they'd be interested. It should appeal to local authorities with pockets of land that are currently of little or no value. It gives councillors a way of appealing directly to their own constituents to be seen to be doing something. And it's not to say that they're not doing things. As Jackie said, Janet Morpeth's big report shows that about half the councils are trying to do something. And so this is just another way for them to try and do something, I think. So the idea, I think, is that local authorities would identify, I don't know, they know how many people they got on their council house waiting list, they know the mix, and they know what sorts of houses they need. They should then go out and look at all the pockets of land they've got knocking around, and maybe do an initial viability study on them themselves if they like. If it gets serious, they should then become involved with 1 or 2 local builders, I think, rather than national builders, to say, look, why don't we try this new idea out, take it further, take it to the point where they think that it's a goer, and then when it's a goer, a proper contract is signed on a site-by-site basis between the council and the builder, where the builder takes all the risk, all the development risk, and takes all the development profit. I think joint ventures with councils are wrong. I think they're risky, and I think they fall apart very quickly when times get bad. I know there's lots of them going on, but there's also lots of them going wrong. And I think it's much better, if you want to attract private capital in, to allow private capital to have a proper return, and that's not 6 or 7% on the PRH. It should be 20%, because that's what they get on the private. Why shouldn't they get it on the PRH? And just to finalise, the key to it is this site-by-site viability. You haven't got that, you shouldn't do it. It's loose fit. The land could come from either the council, could come from the state, could come from a private owner coming to you with a bit of land and saying, if you give me permission for this, I'll build you 4 council houses on it. And the guiding principle remains the same, which is a mutual reward. Council gets the houses, the developer gets the profit. That's essentially it for me. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Eamon now.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, everybody. Hi, Natalie. So first of all, thanks very much for inviting me along today. I think to put a council perspective, I think, on the conversation you've already heard. I'd like to thank Localis and the Housing Finance Institute, both for commissioning the report and bringing it all together, but also to Jackie and Peter for writing it. I'd like, actually, it's very timely, Natalie, a special tribute, I think, goes to you, Natalie, from me. I think you may remember you and I went out to Colchester and Eastbourne back in 2015-16 when HFI was just getting off the ground, to try and encourage the councils and the Almos there to just think out of the box a little bit on land assembly and using their resource and getting things together. And it's really great to see it all going so well some years on. So I'm Managing Director of the National Federation of Almos, which is about 23 council-owned management companies. But actually a lot of them have started to move into development as well. So in 2021, they built 740 homes across about 23 organisations. Not a huge sum, but it's a very local contribution. Last year, that went up to about 1,500. Now, there are some challenges coming up, obviously, with building inflation costs and the like, but nevertheless, it's a contribution that's solely being delivered by councils, for councils. The other role I've got, as Steve said, is I'm chair of the Barnet Group. So Barnet Council has 5 companies in a group. It includes a HR company, an adult social care company, a home company that manages its council housing, but also a registered provider called Open Door Homes. And Open Door Homes is a separate board from the board that I chair, and I'll just touch on that in a moment, but is now up to about 600 units in ownership, 350 new build, all affordable rent to date, except for just a little margin I'll come to in a moment, but also done over 200 acquisitions as well, which has pulled that asset base together. So in both those roles, I'm fortunate to be in a position where I'm trying to encourage and help councils to build more homes using different models of delivery. Now, I'm no expert on land assembly or SPAL or viability or whatever, so forgive me if you're looking for any of that. It's just a few thoughts probably from a council perspective, and I've put a few points under 2 main headings. I think the first one is a title report around public rental homes. Personally, when I read the report, I thought it was a great idea, just that an acronym. We've had lots of discussions in the social sector about whether social housing and social tenants is the right thing. The tenants themselves felt stigmatized by the word social and social rent. And there's a number of groups at the moment trying to actually tackle that. So I think maybe moving towards PRH would be really, really helpful. I started back in 1977 as a housing management trainee when the GLC had 220,000 properties and there was 5 million council homes in England. Social housing is now down to about 3.8, which 60% is owned by housing associations, because of course I started pre-right to buy, pre-stock transfer. But I often get frustrated in Parliament, David, hope you don't mind me saying, when ministers are asked how many social rented units were built last year, you get this 47,950. And I sit there going, of course you didn't. We built 6,000. They mix up affordable, intermediate, shared ownership, and social. So the councils, they know what a social rented property is. It's the lowest end of a very long spectrum. So in Barnet, it goes from £120 for a 2-bed council to 220 for affordable to 320 for private rent or market. We all know, especially in London, how this works. So I think having a different collective term, I think again it was mentioned by Peter, is we're quite happy to say the PRS covers a huge sector. It's bigger than the public sector at the moment, but it goes from Duke of Westminster to buy-to-let landlords to some of my neighbours who are what I call amateur landlords who've got a property left by mum and dad and make a pretty bad job of managing it. But that's all called the PRS. So why don't we have something a little bit more collective that talks about what we're doing in the council social rented space? So you remember those days of the DSS and Department of Social Security, I think, Steve, in particular, if you remember, that thing social was often a stigma. It was a label. You're on the social, you're out of work. So I think something moved away from that's got to be helpful. Second main point, I think, is that councils and developers should work more closely. But at this point, I'd also commend Rob Bealey, who's with us today, an article he just did recently in Inside Housing about councils needing to have clarity about what they're doing and leave it to the professionals. I'm afraid I've worked far too long with local officials, councillors. Some of them are absolutely fantastic. Their ambition is there, their spirit and energy is there, but along comes this ideology, which suddenly takes it away from maybe where it should be. So if I look at someone like Open Door Homes in Barnet, we've got a situation where the board is packed with development experts. That's all that's on our board. There's 9 members on the Open Door Homes boards. Some of them work for Newlon, for Swan, they're ex-architects. We've just left it to them to work, in some cases, with the private sector. Because, as we know, there are some local authority development companies that are dormant. There are some that have got themselves into a bad place, like Croydon and Lambeth. I would commend a little bit bias, but the Barnet model, where the council has an overall ambition, it puts the land and the money in, would like to see a good outcome. But other than that, it's left it to the Barnet Group and to Open Door Homes to just get on with it. And I mentioned 350 affordable units, but just last October, sorry, you won't be able to see this, but we opened a new development at Hermitage Lane. It's in Cricklewood, just on the edge of the borough with Camden, where together with Hill Group, we built 52 new homes, 31 for market sale, 15 for affordable rent, and 6 shared ownership. And the 15 affordable and the 6 shared ownership are owned by Open Door Homes. So we have just moved into, away from affordable, our first dip into shared ownership. And next year we're working with the council on the possibility of taking over a regeneration scheme on the Graham Park estate in Colindale. It's already in the hands of Notting Hill Genesis and some other partners, but the council has got that sort of vote of confidence in us, such that we are now talking to them about potentially taking over some regen work. So I really strongly recommend that we leave some of these things to the experts. In this case, I think the private sector, to take the risk and do the nitty-gritty and make it happen. Just make sure you've got some people on the council side. There's some terrible examples out there, like Nottingham City Council with their energy company, where they lost 38 million and brought the whole council down. Thurrock with its solar panel farms or whatever it was, but getting into commercial ventures is something that councils need to be very, very careful with. So I think the beauty of this model, I think, from a council perspective, is that, as Peter said and Jack said, the risk is with the developer, the margins with them, because that's fair enough. I think that's the way it should work. But for the benefits of the councils, you do get new supply, particularly on those tricky sites, those smaller areas. That Hermitage Lane site with some old scrap yards and shops that were just sitting there for years and years. Secondly, we may have this different branding. If we talk about public rental homes, that might be something really worth looking at. And also on top of that, I think homes for rent in perpetuity, I think, is something that's mentioned in the report. and something that lots of councils will find quite attractive. They're put off by the thought that if they build anything anywhere near the housing revenue accounts, or anywhere there, it will get subject to right-to-buy and it will be gone one day. And there have been some examples of that having happened, even with high values to start with. In 5, 10 or 15 years, you might lose some. So the idea of having properties renting in perpetuity is probably very attractive to councils. So I think finally, congratulations everyone. I think this report should be publicised. I think we should try and get politicians and council officers to think out of the box a little bit more, take the model, as Peter said, turn it upside down and see what we can do. Because going back to that Hermitage Lane site, I think we might have followed the spirit of the report actually by doing that sort of side-by-side viability, but I think we just did it by accident. It just felt like the right thing to do. Get a developer, we've got this tricky little site, what are we going to do for it? What are we going to get out of it? The developer's got their properties and their profit. The council got some homes out of it. So maybe we were following the spirit of your report without realising it. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm perhaps unique as being the distinct non-expert on a panel of people who are experts, but what I seek to do is to share some thoughts about a political response to the issues that this report highlights based on my time as chairman of the all-party parliamentary group for housing and planning, and the fact that certainly my 20-odd years in local government, I started out as chairman of a planning committee. And I'm still frustrated to discover that some of the sites on which we granted consent for homes in 1998 are still undeveloped, having been sold on from developer to developer, gaining ever denser development consents, but yet no homes ever having been delivered. And this comes at a time when the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill is making its way through Parliament, which is about the government's response, the Conservative Party's response to how we deal with these issues. And that for me is a really important starting point. Okay. Jackie, in her introduction, made reference to, is it really a crisis if it's been going on for 40 years? And that's a really good question to start with, because it certainly feels like a housing market which is very, very divided. If you walk through the door of Hillingdon or Harrow councils in my constituency, and you need a 3 or 4 bedroom family home, the answer is if you want to stay local, you will have to wait probably between 5 and 10 years to be provided with a social rented home. If you want to move in tomorrow, the council can find you somewhere to go in Birmingham or Coventry or in South Wales. So we know that the housing market is extremely divided. And this morning I was watching, not knowing that she was going to be here, my colleague Natalie Alphick, who's in the front row, at the Home Affairs Select Committee, when they were looking at the issues of the Homes for Ukraine scheme and what's going on with the accommodation of people who come to the UK as refugees. And it's very striking that despite the fact that the 36 local authorities in the southeast of England all volunteered to accommodate asylum seekers for the Home Office, none of them are being used because the Home Office cannot find any accommodation that is both within budget and that doesn't mean competing against people who are on housing waiting lists. And yet, if we go to large parts of the north of England, many cities, many coastal towns, accommodation can freely be found of the necessary size for family homes. So there is a key point here around the fact that the UK economy is quite uniquely unbalanced. If you are somebody looking to find a home that you can afford to live in on an essential but relatively lower income job, you are going to have a huge challenge in London and the southeast of England. I'm married to an NHS doctor. I'm very struck at having followed the paths of people who started out at medical school together. Those who are newly minted consultants, 9 years post-graduation experience in Caerphilly, where I grew up, can buy a 5-bedroom manor house with an extensive area of land. The ones who are looking to settle in London are helped by people looking for a 1-bedroom flat. And that is the extent of the contrast. It is absolutely enormously divided. So the question that then leads on to for the central government is, what is the most important policy objective that we are trying to achieve here? Because we have the very significant part that the development industry plays in our economy.
We know that that development industry is dependent, as Peter described, on a certain profit margin that is being achieved on sites that are being developed at a specific rate. We at the same time have significant numbers of people who are on housing waiting lists and a very large cost to local authorities putting people into temporary accommodation, which creates a real financial priority around addressing that. And within that, we have, and this is a real area of interest for our all-party parliamentary group, some numbers that we might describe as the priority counts, for example, people with learning disabilities, people who need extra care housing, while finding that an approach which has historically been very much one size fits all about delivering the largest possible numbers of new units are not finding the type of accommodation that they need to identify. And it seems to me that there is a real role for local authorities in working with developers to bring forward the kinds of developments that address the needs of those priority groups of tenants, partly because they are very, very high cost when inadequate provision is made for them, but also because they are growing in terms of the proportion of that market needing to be provided for. Another area that this report highlights, which is an interesting one, and it comes back to Peter's calculation, which I have to say I found quite fascinating. I've always found the financing of the housing market. Yeah, it is quite sad. But actually, I remember Ken Livingstone, when he was Mayor of London, talking about the need to follow the money to understand what's going on in the area of public policy. And that's absolutely spot on. That 1947 legislation that allowed local authorities to acquire land at its present value. So there was no uplift from the landowner for the fact that agricultural or other land was going to be redeveloped for housing. That was a big driving force behind the 1950s expansion of social housing, certainly in my constituency and in the areas around it. You can see those developments when they were built and understand how significant that was. So how we make sure, and I'm not advocating that we have the government sequestration of land on a large scale to enable this to happen, but we need to think about, in particular, what the sources of finance may be that would make those margins, and in particular the finance cost element of that calculation, significantly more affordable. And I'm very conscious when I talk to private developers, a conversation they often don't really want to have is how they organise their financing. So I'm very, very conscious often finance comes from a company which is owned by the developer, but the cost of that finance for that individual development is not provided at a commercial rate, it's provided at what you might describe as an usurious rate. If the commercial rate is 2.5%, 3% at that given moment, the developer will be lending to their own development company at 12 or 15%. So we know that that creates an additional and very large profit margin in that calculation, which in turn is holding back the policy objective of delivering the homes that we need to have. The second area which I just highlight of interest at the APPG is the capacity of the planning system. And a couple of folks I spoke to over coffee this morning made reference to the fact that as planning has moved from being a profit centre for local authorities to being something which represents a very significant cost, the ability of local authorities to deploy highly qualified, experienced professionals to ensure that local planning objectives are fulfilled has become enormously constrained. So we've gone from a situation where the fees that were charged meant that for local authorities it was both worthwhile in policy terms, but more importantly deliverable financially, to have highly experienced, well-qualified, well-resourced planning teams to a situation where, especially for smaller developers with smaller sites, they may be waiting for a very, very long time, getting sometimes not a very good service to get that home, that site to the point of consent. So the question then, what is the role of the state and what's the role of the government in this? Is it the case that government needs to be, as it was in the 1940s and 50s, a direct intervener in this market through either legislation or through taking financial action, for example, by saying that developers who are providing affordable homes have to use money funded through public borrowing rather than through commercial sources as a means of massively reducing some of those costs? Or is it more as an enabler, for example, by making it easier for local authorities to either compulsory purchase sites in order to make development possible, or by providing greater freedom, things like the housing revenue account, to use some of that income, to an extent this is already happening, to finance borrowing to enable development to take place. And that in turn, of course, leads to the final question of viability. But I am optimistic, I think, as is characteristic of Localis reports, and I'm a director of Localis, so I would say this perhaps, it's encouraging to read something which contains solutions and ideas rather than something which simply describes a problem. And it seems to me that in the context of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, there are some real opportunities here to think about. Does the government need to be thinking about a national approach to the issue of housing? Or do we need to think in a different way, very much based perhaps on a regional approach in the way that we see as common in other countries? And we've seen in that legislation and in the debate around it, a lot of talk about development zones, about having things like Freeport's flat as economic magnets that would then in turn attract some housing development around the area. But do we need to think about saying there will be a completely different approach to planning in the Midlands or the North or in Wales or the South West compared to what we have in London and the South East in order to be able to address this? And how would that be enabled through the legislative process? So all of these things, it seems to me, come back to the key Localis point, that it is through effective local and regional leadership. See the things that mayors like Andy Street, I'm sure there's Andy Burnham perhaps are doing. That is the route by which we will address these issues. It isn't going to be about people in Whitehall. It isn't going to be about legislation in Parliament. It's going to be about working through those levers and finding ways to make homes that we need as a country, that key policy objective, more deliverable at a local level.
Okay, opportunity to ask questions. If they are complicated financial questions, Peter will answer them. If they are policy questions, the rest of the panel, I am sure, will dive in. So, who wants to kick off?
So Paul Disley-Tyndall from Tyndall Trade, we're a property investment development company. I have a question about local authorities achieving best value for their sites. I noticed you spoke for the part of the process. I'm sure it's been considered, but I think what you're saying that the land value is expressed by the model. But I just wondered how that fitted in with the local authority's duty to achieve best value for on land sales.
Yeah, I could probably go for that. I think this is where my knowledge of finance begins to wallow around in deep water here. But we did talk to SIPFA, and it would seem, talking to an expert there, that best value, the legal meaning of it has changed in the past. I can't remember exactly what's happened. But it seemed to us after talking to SIPFA that the councils had more latitude to put land into these models than they perhaps thought they had or even think they have now, and can perhaps go in at nothing. And the other point I would make is that if you value this land on its current, the land, these little pockets of land are probably worth absolutely nothing anyway without the permission, if you see what I mean. So you're starting off with land that isn't worth anything to start with. But I accept the fact that once you put houses on it, it will be worth something. Beyond that, you'd have to start talking to housing finance people. But I got the impression that it can be done. Just to come back on David's point, we deliberately avoided going down the route of demanding CPO. Because everybody's been demanding CPO of land for about 1,000 years, and it's not happened. And it would be lovely if it did happen, but there's no point in coming up with a solution that relies upon the CPOing of land at current use value. It's, you know, it'll happen. It might happen one day. So this process relies upon the land almost going in at nothing. The land doesn't have to be worth anything because the profit is already built into the growth development value. See what I mean? You know what I mean. You know how it works, perhaps better than I do. I'm not sure that answered your question fully. That's the best I can do.
Okay, some of us still bear the scars of trying to do CPOs. And that's a story for another.
Just going to add very briefly, Steve, that of course you've got the Social Value Act, which enables local authorities to make decisions, financial decisions, based upon a broader interpretation of value than simply the basic financial return. So in the old days, before best value, you had compulsory competitive tendering, which essentially said legally you are obliged to take the cheapest offer. That moved to best value, which said you could look at it in a broader sense. So for a local authority with a site, knowing that you will have a revenue stream coming in from a tenant on in that property, knowing that that will reduce your emergency accommodation costs by a significant figure. All of those are financial elements of that, as opposed to what is simply the auction value of this particular site if we were to sell it. And I think that broader perspective is where we're getting to.
Yeah, that's the correct answer.
Jonathan, I assume you're going to wave at me if there is somebody in the online audience who wants to ask you a question.
We do indeed, Steve. I'll fire this one. This is from Mark Collins, CBRE. Congratulates Peter and Jackie on the paper.
How is he?
We'll find out. Basically, his question is, how can we fast track and support the SME community in particular in delivery and supporting local authorities to meet some of the objectives outlined? How do we support fast track SME builders?
A very good question. Throw that open to the whole panel.
I'll give it a go, but it'll be a partial answer because of course
there is an answer to this which solves another government problem, isn't there, Jackie?
well, one would hope so. And we go back to my premise, which is there are no silver bullets. Okay, these are all partial solutions, right? But we should all we need to play in every string of the fiddle, And hello, Mark. I'm a great believer in training and empowering people, particularly frontline local government officers. I am super impressed with the training course that's been put together by SIPFA and ACES, the Association of Chief Estate Surveyors, which is designed to basically empower and train asset managers to be able to do this work, right? There's a huge resurgence in the wish to work in partnership on behalf of local authorities. I'm doing a session with the District Council Network about this on Friday, this week. I've been asked by the Estates Gazette to put together a panel of, I think they're calling it the Public Sector Forum, of local authority and other public sector people who can talk to the investor community about how to work in partnership. There's a lot of work going on in this arena. And Mark, you're on the money about SME builders. We don't think, from our knowledge of the property industry, that actually the volume house builders will be particularly interested in this model anyway. We think that it'll be local authorities going out and finding sites and then approaching the right sort of partner. How you triage that work is the devil's in the detail there, and that's the work I'll be doing, hoping to do with the Estates Gazette and others. But I mean, there is help out there. I'm looking again at ACES about how to get into partnership with your local developers. The big push here, and Mark Collins of CBRE has got massive experience in this arena. He chairs the housing business for CBRE. I used to work for him. And the big push here could be the stimulus of the SME and regional house builders, which we know have really struggled in the last 2 decades at least. So I think there's all to play for here. I haven't got all the answers, but I do think that this provides the opportunity.
Okay, I'll just add, I'll come back. I think that there's been various attempts, so as David will know, over the last 5 or 6 years to try and stimulate construction of homes by small builders. And it hasn't worked very well. I think Jackie and I went to a very bibulous lunch a few months ago where all the small builders around the table came up with the answer, which I thought was terrific, which was allow them to have help to buy for smaller builders.
And not for the volume boys. And not for the volume.
And not to the volume builders. So in other words, they've had their fill. It's now the turn of the government to help smaller builders. I can't address the rules, but let's say in this thing, you would be, if you did this or even did any small housing site under a small number, if the builders fit in with the thing, they're allowed to have help to buy. And then the major house builders, I know they want it back, but I don't think they should be allowed to have it back. I think if you're going to one thing to stimulate the smaller builders would be to give them help to buy. And I think that would just add an incentive, I think, not just for this thing, but for all small builders all around. The other thing I'll be interested, this is me asking a question, really. The bill is now going through the House of Lords line by line. I was asked by one peer who I spoke to about it, whether anything could be done at this late stage of the bill with this. And I don't know, is there an answer to that, David, do you think? Or is it all too late?
It's never too late. I mean, I think the short answer is yes, things can always be changed. I know Natalie and I are relatively new members of Parliament, so we've seen quite a few changes of direction in a relatively short period of time. Specifically on that question, if it is the appropriate piece of legislation to deal with it, I don't know, but should I find out? Okay.
And again, just to say, I say no expert in this area, but I was actually had a meeting with a builder in our local area, Barnet, just last week. He started out 20 years ago with a company with zero. He's up to turnover now about 75 million a year. And he was asking me, how does he get past the big boys and girls? So I don't know where in the food chain you decide what's a small and medium enterprise. That's just a question I would almost ask, because if you've got someone 75 million who's struggling to beat the big boys, I think, right, I know that the volume builders are on the billions, but we've at Barnet are trying to use, companies like the Hill Group, Bugler, and a few others, and build up that partnership with them. I don't know where in the food chain exactly they sit, but I think they're small, certainly medium size, and that's what again we're trying to do locally, because some of these companies are also based locally as well. So that's the other thing. You're looking at local labour and local input and other local benefits. So that's just my contribution.
Okay. Anyone in the room? Yes, gentleman back.
So I'm Neil Webster from the organisation that Jackie's referred to as ACES. So if anyone wants to talk about it afterwards, fine. Couple of questions. Peter, did you infer grant?
Did I?
Infer grant at a point in time? And if so, what's the new word for that? Yeah. Secondly, the examples seem to be a bit further south. In this huge database you picked up, what are the two good examples a little bit further north?
I didn't hear the second half of that question, actually.
So the examples I was sort of hearing, Barnet and tend to be from a bit further south. What examples that reference this work a bit further north? You said there was lots of good examples out there, in this database. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think. Jackie, do you want to have a go at that?
Not really. It's a shame. It's a shame that Janice isn't here actually to talk about her report, but I can send it to you, Neil. Basically, she has documented all the local authorities who've done anything in this arena. Yeah. And of course, it is easier in the north, as David's already very ably outlined, and you know all about this. But there is stuff going on out there. There's just not enough going on out there, and it's as simple as that, really. And to go back to your question about grant, I think you'd advocate contribution. Is that right?
I just said contribution. It sounds better than grant. I think it's just free money, isn't it? I suppose what I was trying to say on that front was that the government. I mean, I'm not an expert on housing finance. There's plenty of those in the room, but I suspect some schemes only work with a grant, and therefore that should be taken into account in this model. And if the land value goes negative, part of making it come back up to zero could be grant. Part of it could be housing revenue account, I think, and part of it could be left on the table as social value or something like that. This is where I don't profess expertise. The only thing that people don't fully understand normally is if the residual land value is nothing, that doesn't mean the site can't be built, because there's 20% there of profit already. So getting to nothing is not a bad thing.
Okay. Yes, gentlemen.
Hello, Peter Ellis from Homes Within Homes. And it's Barnet rearing its head again because I don't know, 40, 50 years ago, I was a councillor in Burntide, which neighbours Graham Park, and we had a huge estate of council houses. And what they did, they provided a nexus, a direct link between the community that needed affordable housing and the local authority. Obviously, with the sale of that, there's a great gap in the middle, which in new build terms is called reliance on the private sector. And I think the work's fantastic. But the question I'd ask is, if we're being honest, do we think new build is going to solve the problem? My own view on that is that, our national wealth is a societal asset. that if it's used properly for societal best interest, can solve many of our problems. In the housing sector, our existing housing stock is societal asset. We've got 25 million homes, and if we encourage just a small fraction of those house owners to convert their homes to separate areas of living for tenants on, let's call it a societal market tenancy, social market tenancy, and we look to the leadership of local authorities to directly get a nexus with that extra source of supply, we can do the housing. Okay. So what I'm saying is, going back to this one, do we not, and also naturally here, you know, the problem you have in finding homes for key workers, for people coming out of homelessness, for asylum seekers, it's the same one that you have. You know, it's a different one, but later the affordable housing issue, which is we don't want to really go too far from share our attention. And if we can create separate areas of living, we've got a means for dealing with all these groups.
Thank you. I think to answer your second question, that's sort of ultra virus for me, really. That sounds like a good idea and should be pursued. I think, will this PRH thing solve the housing problem? No, of course it won't. There was a temptation, especially in my brain as an ex-surveyor, to add up a lot of numbers and put a headline on this press release to say this is going to produce X number of new council houses a year. And I think we resisted that temptation because it's not real. What's real is that this idea is there for councils to pick up upon. And these things take a long time. And I think, you know, I could give you a number if you like. You know, you take X number of councils, set up Y number of programs to build Z number of houses over the next 5 years. Yes, you could end up with a few thousand houses more, council houses more. So that's why we left the number out. And it's why we say this is an additional idea that allows councils to engage more fully with the process, with less risk than they're getting at the moment, and with the benefit of being able to tell their voters that they're doing something about it. So that's essentially, you know, this is quite a narrow idea, really. I know I wouldn't want to push it as anything more than that.
I'm conscious that we promised you that we'd do about an hour of this, and then I'm going to bring Natalie in. So I'm going to bring the rest of the panel in, because actually in some ways, some of the things that you just raised lead very nicely into what I think Natalie is going to talk about. But just so the rest of the panel know, this is your kind of a chance to say not only in response to that question, but any other final comments you want to make. And if anybody else from the audience wants to come in before I ask them, now is the moment. Yep.
I'm just sorry, I don't know if it works, but my name is Mina. I work for St. Thomas. I just want to ask about, like, okay, we all know that council have got land, but how much of that land is actually viable to build on? So what percentage is contaminated? What percentage is greenfield? What percentage is brownfield? And then who's actually going to pay money to assess the viability for this? Because, okay, so one thing is, okay, I have got a piece of land, but there's also planning laws, right? So how much we can build on this, and then actually is it viable to build on? So who is going to put the bill to begin with?
I think it's
Sorry, just I'll get everything in, and then I'm going to come to you all.
oh, okay. Go on then.
Is there any more online?
But that's a quick one from Martha Dillon. How do the recommendations align with urgent need to retrofit over the next 10, 20 years?
That is a quick one.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of observations for the panel. I think the section 123 best value conundrum, which was mentioned at the start of the question, it's a real barrier for local authorities. And I think some of the ideas that David has floated about perhaps using the levelling up bill to give just a little bit more clarity to local authorities there would be really welcome.
Yeah.
An observation about district surveyors. And I suppose a need for realism in land value. We've all worked with local authorities that have got that scrappy piece of land in the ledger at a value of 3 million. As you've articulated, Peter, it ain't worth 3 million unless somebody's going to come along and write a check. And guess what? They're not going to. So let's have a little bit of realism about what land is worth. And just a final observation, and I think this, is about some of the things that Serge has been doing, which is there are lots and lots of institutions out there that are prepared to forward fund developments. And I think there's a huge amount that can be done to join up local authorities, institutions, and SME developers to reduce the cost of funds and de-risk funding of difficult sites.
Right, back to the panel. I'm going to go left to right so that Jackie actually gets the last word.
Oh, okay. All right, this is my last blast from me, if you like. I first of all like to thank David, actually. I thought I knew a lot about this subject, but I didn't know about the subject. I didn't know about developers borrowing their own money and charging 4 times as much in the appraisal. That's a cracker, isn't it? Bloody hell. Okay, where's the land coming from? There was a piece in one of the papers last week that 60,000 pieces of land have been identified by some satellite company or other. The fact is that probably 80% of that land is not viable. It's either covered in muck or it needs money spending on it, but we can do anything about it. I suppose the message is that there's probably still a lot of hidden corners in the towns and villages of Britain where you could build decent housing for people using this model. And I think it wouldn't be beyond the wit of councils to investigate that and say, look, we want a 10-year plan, we want to do this. Let's find, we need to build, say, 1,000 houses over the next 10 years, small council. Let's find enough land that's poking around that's going to be good. It shouldn't cost too much money to evaluate the land that will work viably. But you're right, there's a lot of the land, it just won't work at all because it's contaminated. I think the realisation on land values is quite good. Again, it's not my topic, but I think if councils are sitting on land that they think is worth X, and in fact it's worth 0, they should be forced to drop it to 0. Otherwise it's their balance sheets are false if they think this land is worth anything. How you go about doing that, I have no idea. And what fuss it would cause, I don't know. But if it's worth 0, they should be on the balance sheet at 0, which makes it easier then, presumably, to get on and put some PRH on it.
Yes, I was just going to pick up Peter's point there. It's very, very timely. A little bit around Burns Oak that Peter mentioned. I actually went to school there on the Watling estate. We talk about it was Homes for Heroes estate, built in the 1920s, about 2,000 homes, owned by the GLC at one time. A lot of them now sold under right to buy, but still the poorest ward in Barnet. And what I see there is a council and its company working together for a more local solution, which is the outcome of which is the old area housing office, which was owned by the GLC, has now got a 75-bedded extra care scheme. It's going to be opened later this year, built by us in Barnet at Open Doors. We've got just up the road an old registry office. It was all run down. That's now turned into another 30 units of affordable housing. And the council is going to be looking after the Watling Market site just nearby. So I think the main thing I'd be saying is it's about Localis, it's about local solutions, and that's one ward, the poorest ward in the borough, where the council, both Conservative previously and Labour now, is focusing its efforts using both its own resources. Some of this is council-led, some is company-led, but the overall ambition is to lift the area into a better place.
So I think a lot of the questions have showed many of the technical challenges around getting this right. I think the point about what is the book value of an asset. I mean, clearly we know the way to determine something is to do an auction and see what somebody's willing to pay for it. For a local authority, there isn't, although you could create a notional valuation for all like capital assets, they are of course extremely extensive. So Hillingdon, one of my local authorities, owns about 12,500 council homes in the housing revenue account. And then vast areas of land, including a lot of things like council farms, like legacy from the post-war period, the GLC. But as has been described, to establish a value for them, you need to auction them, and that would be determined by development. In terms of what auditors would say about that, because the local authority is not borrowing against its capital assets, it borrows against its revenue streams. The capital value of the assets as a whole is not seen as very relevant by the auditors. And so it isn't something that produces quite the effect really of saying that would revalue those property assets to a lower level and make them open for disposal. And it kind of goes back really to the best value argument. And we see this really from developers with viability. Is a local authority best off saying, let's get the most money we possibly can for that site and then recycle that to fund some other activity? Or is the value that we get in the round by creating social housing, homes for rent, whatever it may be on that site, going to mean that this is kind of something that we can convince local people financially looks like a good deal? And then finally, I'm just picking up the point that was made about the view of homes as being a national asset. Like, one of the things that is quite distinct about the UK is the very extensive level of owner occupation of homes. So we are quite distinct compared to most of the rest of Europe. And that has a lot of consequences. Interesting, in planning, a lot of the views from government have been about, could we go down this route of encouraging householders to build up? Now, certainly in my constituency, where there are streets and streets of 1930s homes, all of the same design, the last thing that the people who live there want, and the last thing that the planners want, is individual units, often in terraces, being taken out and redeveloped for different kinds of home. So I think there's a practical and logistical challenge. And the fact that those individuals own those sites means that there is, unless you go for a wholesale change in the approach to planning, no practical way of bringing about forcing a change. And to connect the question that was asked online, the government has been learning from what's been going on with things like the Green Homes Grant, that in fact, it sounds like a brilliant idea in theory, but we're a local authority with 12,000 homes and find a contractor and say, all of those homes need to be insulated, or they all need a air source heat pump, or whatever it may be. Getting millions and millions of people, each of whom own a single unit, to upgrade it to a particular standard of insulation and environmental friendliness is an enormous challenge. So where the Dutch equivalent would be, we're just going to demolish all of those houses and build a whole load of new ones, all for rent, just like the old ones were, all to a higher standard. In the UK, that is legally, financially, logistically, not a deliverable option. So we need to think about a different approach to that question.
Because it's very, very that. I'm not talking about knocking down houses and building. I'm saying make the internal configuration of houses more satisfactory.
Well, all I would say in conclusion is thank the good Lord that Eamon and David were available this morning, because I have to say it's been a fantastic contribution to the thinking that Pete and I put into this. I mean, this is only one idea, okay? We're not claiming that we can solve the housing crisis, far from it. When we did the numbers, we were a little bit askance about how low they became, and how, you know, we didn't head up the press release with, you know, we're going to provide X thousand homes, because, you know, we knew it wouldn't stand that much scrutiny. This is only one idea. We do tend to get very bogged down in the housing policy debate, and you know, I was very diverted by the homes within homes concept, which I'd never heard of before. Last week, there was a massive splash on national broadcast media about an infill scheme in Bristol. You know, all the housing commentators were going, but we need the 300,000 a year. Yes, we need 300,000 a year, but we've got to let 1,000 flowers bloom to be able to get there. And we spend a lot of time analysing the problem and not coming up with many solutions. I was very grateful to David for pinpointing the fact that what Pete and I were really after was a solution. It might not be perfect, but we really wanted a solution. I am afraid I'm terribly old-fashioned. I go back to the old Addison values, really, of 1918. Somebody mentioned Homes for Heroes. Of the three pillars of public policy being health, education and housing, I believe we've lost our way in all of this. Health and education are still there, central, and housing seems to have fallen away. And I think we've just got to, and forgive me, I'm a very simplistic soul. I do a lot of work with local authorities who just want to do this. I think we've just got to get on and deliver. And if there are obstacles in the way, we've got to go to the likes of the wondrous David Simmons and ask them and Natalie Elphick, and ask them to break them down for us, because we have got to deliver on the ground.
I think that summarises the key thought behind our report. HFI is an organisation, Localis is an organisation which tries to raise issues, open up discussion, but also in a way which actually makes things happen. One of the really interesting things about this conversation has been, I think, a recognition that there is no, as I think you said this right at the beginning, there isn't a golden bullet, but there are a myriad of different things that we can try, some of which weren't part of this report, but are really interesting in a different aspect. I spent ages looking at how you could build on airspace and those kind of things, and finding all of these things have to be pursued. Some will work in some areas, some won't. This is one approach, but the key message is we cannot just sit here and wait for something to happen. And I'm going to ask Natalie, who has been sitting there very quietly, to talk about, partly to respond to this, but also what else the HFI may be looking at doing, again, potentially in partnership with Localis over the next period, in a very practical way to make some things happen. Natalie.
Thank you very much, Sir Steve. So thank you everyone for coming this morning, and to Jackie and Peter for actually really starting that firing gun, for saying what are we going to do to actually start moving this conversation forward again in a fresh way. And the title, as many people have said, on public rental homes, I think is really an opportunity to start that fresh conversation away from the labels that have attracted the conversation to date. Now, the Housing and Finance Institute was set up in order to turn those issues, these discussions around housing policy into housing delivery. It came about, it was announced in the budget in 2015, and it was a recommendation of the Alpec House Review, which I and Keith House did at that time. And I'm really pleased to welcome a number of founder directors here today of the HFI, as well as current directors of the Institute. Because what the Institute does is it brings together on both a cross-party and a cross-sector basis ideas and practical assistance to help make sure that people can deliver the homes that are needed. And at the heart of the work that we do at the HFI is helping councils to be those housing delivery enablers, to shape and deliver for their communities in a way that the nature and the shape of the housing is right for their communities. So for a number of years, we've run a programme called Housing Business Ready. Eamon referenced it and was very kind in giving his time in supporting the programme. Over that time, we helped hundreds of councillors and council officers and others understand what the options were, what other people were doing, how they might bring forward on a really practical level some of the housing opportunities in their area. And it's been touched on time and again in the conversation and in the questions that no area is alike to another. Each area has its own ambitions, its own shape, and its own housing opportunities and needs. And that's at the heart of the work that we're all trying to deliver. Now, Housing Business Ready was a programme that came out very much of a time of constrained public finances, huge housing need, and great housing opportunity. So we roll forward to 2023, and we are once again in a time of constrained public finances, huge housing need, but also huge housing opportunities. And a number of those key metrics and features are still there. Planning permissions that haven't been built out, questions about what the role is of each party, what the role is of councils, what is the way in which they can work with partners to bring forward homes. And also what is the ambition for the area in terms of bringing forward different types of housing, particularly against a climate of extreme pressures on waiting lists and temporary accommodation. And I think we have a real national challenge to deal with that. It is our duty and responsibility to make sure that people have the homes that they need, that they're homes that are affordable, and that we have homes that are across a whole market delivering for the area. So as we now roll forward from this exciting report today, and thank you again, Jackie and Peter, for really firing up the conversation today. I think that's been a tremendous and appropriate response from everyone in the questions. I'm pleased to say that we will be bringing forward very shortly a new programme for 2023, where the HFI will be working once again with others to help councils and partners see what can be delivered in this climate. This particular climate that, although it has those same characteristics, constrained public finances, housing need and opportunity, is operating in a very different environment. And it's vital that we make sure that we can move forward, particularly in the next 18 months, where it's looking as if there might be a bit of a downturn in housing supply. We can't afford a decline in housing supply, because actually we need the homes to continue to be delivered, whatever the climate in the broader sense. And in climates like this, it's always a wonderful opportunity to look at what can be done to bring forward public rented housing, and also to bring forward a whole array of affordable and other homes to meet that national need. So I'm really delighted that the HFI and Localis have been working so well together. At the heart of both of their objectives is putting local first. And moving forward, HFI will be going out with its new programme and helping councils once again work with others to ensure that we can deliver the homes that our country needs. So thank you all for attending, and I look forward to this being the first of many launches of and discussions around housing and what can be done by all of us. Thank you.
That brings the formal part of this to a conclusion. Can I thank all of you